Hi everyone, my name is Joseph Koensgen. Welcome back to my art studio. Today I'm going to be painting a loon. So a couple summers ago I had a great experience seeing a loon on a calm misty morning just before the sun came up, and it was such a great relaxing scene. I really want to try and capture that in my painting. And so today I'm going to be working on the loon and the loon's reflections, so I'm going to hop on over to the easel and get started. The first thing I'm going to do, like how I do all my paintings, is I'm just going to block everything in, and I'm just going to mix a mid-range value for each of the colors and just get a bit of a loose block in to kind of build the structure of the loon. Now this is going to be especially helpful with this particular piece because I don't want the loon to have a super high contrast, because I kind of want to paint it as though there's a layer of mist between me and the loon. So I'm going to try and build up the colors, the shadows, and the highlights slowly so that I don't have too high of a contrast with this bird. So now I'll just fill in the rest of the body and the back, just very loose. Kind of trace around all those little squares that are going to be on the back of the bird and the bird's wings. It doesn't have to be too precise. I just want to try and build a little bit of that shape right now, just to give me a general idea once I start adding more detail. And then onto the beak. And I am going to be careful within this block-in phase to make sure that I'm staying within my lines and not going over the outlines that I have for this loon. Okay, and just to fill in some of the stripes on the neck and some of the spots that are on the back. And just a little bit of that red color that's going to be for the eye, just to get a general sense of the shape and color. So once I'm ready to start adding detail to the loon's head and neck, I'm going to start with a bit of a shadow color and try and build up from there. And what I'll be doing throughout the entire time I'm painting the loon's head and neck is kind of going back and forth between adding a shadow and then trying to add a lighter color to blend it into the rest of the bird's head. And the reason I want to do that is because a loon's head doesn't have a lot of texture to it, and it looks really smooth. I'm going to try and paint in a tiny little bit of texture, like with these little feather breaks that are on the neck, but a loon's feathers on its head have this really smooth gradient that go from the shadows all the way to the highlights. So what I want to do with that is I want to try and get that smoothness to translate well with all the brush strokes that I'm going to be putting in here. So it's going to start with some of these shadows, and then I'm going to just add tiny bits of white to each one of those colors, and then slowly build it up to get a really nice gradient from shadow to highlight, while also trying to maintain the round shape of the loon's head. So it is going to be a bit of a process and take quite a bit of patience to build up those colors and to get that really nice feel of the shadow blending into the highlight. And a lot of this is going to be achieved by me doing a little bit of a dry brushing, where I have very little paint on the paintbrush and I just slowly add more and more highlight and just try and bring it down into the shadows. This will hopefully create that really nice smooth gradient and that really nice smooth texture going from highlight into shadow. So here I'm just following the contour of the loon's neck, where there's just a tiny bit of a break in the feathers down at the bottom of the neck. And slowly building up those highlights and just being careful to not bring them too far down into the shadows on the loon's head. I want it to have a little bit more of a backlit feel, like the light is coming from behind the loon, so I'm going to try and keep those highlights more to the top edge of the loon's head. So now just adding some brighter highlights, just to really emphasize where the direction of light is coming from, but also remembering to kind of keep that contrast a little bit lower, as though I am looking through that mist, and because I'm looking through that mist, the colors are going to be not quite as saturated and not quite as strong. So I'm just really taking my time, just being patient, building up those highlights. And the one challenging thing about doing it like this is that acrylic dries a little bit darker than when it's wet. So I really have to do a lot of experimentation with my highlights before I paint them on to make sure that the color is the right shade that I want it to be. So now I'm getting into the brightest highlights just around the eye. And then we're going to add that to the top of the head, but just in a very small amount. And then I'm going to add the brightest highlight just right on the top edge, just to give it that glow, and to also kind of separate the loon's head from the misty background. Okay, now onto the beak. And with the beak, it's going to be a little bit more straightforward, where I don't have to worry about the texture and the smoothness of the loon's beak. It's got a much different texture to it, and so I can be a little bit more aggressive with the contrast while still trying to keep a little bit of that softness in there, and making sure that my highlights don't get too light and shadows don't get too dark. And then just the highlight on the top, just to give that nice glow. And now moving on to the eye, I just want to be really, really steady when I put this dark ring around the loon's eye. Just try and help set it in there. And then I'm going to deepen that red color. And I just want to give it that nice burgundy red color with a tiny little bit of highlight right at the bottom of the eye. And paint in the pupil. Just really taking my time with this. And then I go in with the finest brush that I have. It's a very small, very fine pointed brush, and just paint in that little highlight, the reflection of the sky in the eye, and this always brings the animal to life. So now moving on to the bird's neck, I'm just going to add a little bit of a bluish green mixture, because the way the feathers are on the loon's neck, and kind of where they just have those little bit of break, they almost have like an iridescent bluish color to them. So I'm just kind of putting a little bit of a glaze over top, just to kind of add that color and just suggest a hint of that almost shimmering look that those feathers have. So now just highlighting the white stripes that are on the loon's neck. And the highlight color that I'm using here is quite a dull white, in sort of sticking with the theme and feel of the misty day with the low contrast. I'm keeping this highlight color and this bright white quite dull, and making sure that it doesn't get too overpowering against the rest of the bird. So now just going to move on to the body and start adding some of those details. Again here, because the texture of these feathers is quite a bit different than the textures of the feathers on the head, I can be a little bit more loose and I don't have to worry necessarily about making these feathers look smooth. I do want them to have a little bit of texture, and I'm also going to be paying attention to the direction of these feathers to try and give the loon's back that nice rounded shape. And later on, as you'll see, the thing that really helps give it that shape, as you can see with some of the block in, is that the spots on the loon really help accent the shape of the bird's back. So just adding in a few shadows and just following the contour of the loon's body and building those feather structures. I wanted to keep this a fairly light gray, as though there's quite a bit of light falling on this particular part of the loon, and just trying to keep it as subtle as the rest of the bird and the rest of the painting. So adding a tiny bit of highlight and just accenting some of those areas where the light is going to be falling. And then here I'm kind of going over and just doing a little bit of a dry brushing just to kind of very lightly accent some of those highlight areas where the feathers kind of have a little bit of a shine. Again here, the color mixing that I'm doing is really subtle, where I try and build up the colors really slowly so that I don't get too overpowering with either the highlight or the shadow. And now adding in the spots that are on the loon's back, and this will really help bring out that shape and really help bring out that classic look that loons have. So I'm just going to clean up and really define those squares that are on the loon's wings that I did in the block-in phase. And I love adding these spots. It really just makes it look like a loon, and it really brings the rest of the shape of the bird to life. So I just follow the contours of the feathers that I had laid out before, making sure that I'm following those patterns properly as they kind of trail into these stripes that go up towards the bird's neck. And then I'm just adding my brightest highlight color, which is still not very bright compared to the rest of the painting, but it'll really emphasize the direction of light. And then a little bit of that greenish blue color to kind of suggest a little bit of an iridescence to the feathers. So now on to the reflection, and it's going to be the same kind of process as I painted the bird. The only difference here is that the edges of the reflection, as they blend into the water, I want them to be incredibly soft, as though what we're getting is a scattering kind of light effect by looking through layers of mist, and because we're looking at the reflection through moving water. So I really want the edges of this to have that smooth look to them, and not have a very defined sharp edge to them like some of the parts of the loon does. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to fill in a lot of these areas and go back and forth between highlight and shadow to really try and blend the two together to kind of get a seamless transition from the reflection into the rest of the water. And I'm also trying to follow the shape and the movement of the water as it's reflecting this loon. And so I kind of want to keep it not necessarily painting the exact same thing that I'm seeing in the loon, but more so following those contours of the water. So now I'm just going back and adding my different tones and values of my bluish gray color to try and build those soft edges and to really try and blend the whole thing together. Now I'm ready to start adding some darker colors to try and emphasize some of the shadows that are being reflected. And these darks I'm going to slowly build up as well, because I want to make sure that the reflection is just a little bit lighter than the darks and the shadows that are in the Loon. And I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to emphasize some of those ripples that we see in the water by painting some of those shadow parts a little bit darker and leaving a few highlights in between. So now I'm going to go in there with a bit more of a darker color still, emphasize some of those ripples that are in the water, following some of the movements and the shapes. And then once that's done, I'll go back and add a little bit more white to that mixture and just try and build that up and get that nice smooth gradient from shadow to highlight and into the rest of the water. And doing it like this and adding all these layers does take quite a bit of time, but I find that it produces a really effective result for me when I build it up really slowly, especially if I want to be very subtle with my colors, and also paying attention to the fact that acrylic does dry a tiny bit darker than when it's wet. So just like how the spots on the Loon's back and body really seem to bring the whole thing together, once I paint the reflections of those spots in the water, then it really sets the bird in there and it looks like it's actually swimming through the water with these really nice moving and undulating reflections. It's a really satisfying thing to paint when I get to this stage, when I can do the reflections of these spots in the water. And I'm just taking my time and being patient to make sure that I'm getting the reflections to look right, and to get them positioned right, like it's reflecting each individual spot and stripe in the place that it should be. And following the contours of these little ripples that are in the water as it sort of breaks up the reflection, and you have different parts reflected in these different little waves as the Loon moves through the water. And now just for the brightest highlight, to further emphasize the direction of light. And then just further adding those highlights and just kind of cleaning up a few little areas and making sure that all those reflections are looking correct and it looks like they're reflecting each part of the bird properly. And then I'll go in and do the eye. And I just want to make this quite a bit dark and not super obvious, just a little bit of a hint of a reflection of the eye. And then I think I'm nearly done. I'm going to go back and I'm just going to clean up a few of the edges and a few of the ripples and just tidy up some of those lines. And I think with that, I have a finished painting. Trying to capture that early, misty morning on a calm lake with a loon swimming by. I'm very happy with the way this turned out. Thank you so much for watching.